Education in Cambodia is controlled by the state through the Ministry of Education in a national level and by the Department of Education at the provincial level. The Constitution of Cambodia establishes that the state shall protect and upgrade citizens' rights to quality education at all levels, guaranteeing that all citizens have equal opportunity to earn a living. The state shall adopt an education program, according to the principle of modern pedagogy including technology and foreign languages, as well as the state controls public and private schools and classrooms at all levels. The Cambodian education system includes preschool, primary, general secondary, higher education and non-formal education. The education system includes the development of sport, information technology education, research development and technical education. School enrollment has increased during the 2000s in Cambodia. USAID data shows that in 2011 primary enrollment reached 96% of the child population, lower secondary school 34% and upper secondary 21%. History. Traditional Buddhist education before the 20th century. Traditional education in Cambodia was handled by the local Wat, and the bhikkhu were the teachers. The students were almost entirely boys, and the education was limited to memorizing Buddhist chants in Pali. During the period of the French protectorate, an educational system based on the French model was inaugurated alongside the traditional system. Initially, the French neglected education in Cambodia. Only 7 high school students graduated in 1931, and only 50,000 to 600,000 children were enrolled in primary school in 1936. In the year immediately following independence, the number of students rapidly increased. Vickery suggests that education of any kind was considered an absolute good by all Cambodians and that this attitude eventually created a large group of unemployed or underemployed graduates by the late 1960s. The French model from the early 20th century until 1975, the system of mass education operated on the French model. The education system was divided into primary, secondary, higher, and specialized levels. Public education was under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Education, which exercised full control over the system. It established syllabi, hired and paid teachers, provided supplies, and inspected schools. An inspector of primary education, who had considerable authority, was assigned to each province. Cultural committees under the Ministry of Education were responsible for enriching the Cambodian language. Primary education, divided into 2 cycles of 3 years each, was carried out in state and temple-run schools. Successful completion of a final state examination led to the award of a certificate after each cycle. The primary education curriculum consisted of arithmetic, history, ethics, civics, drafting, geography, hygiene, language, and science. In addition, the curriculum included physical education and manual work. French language instruction began in the 2nd year. Khmer was the language of instruction in the 1st cycle, but French was used in the 2nd cycle and thereafter. By the early 1970s, Khmer was used more widely in primary education. In the 1980s, primary school ran from the 1st to the 4th grade. Theoretically, 1 primary school served each village. Secondary education also was divided into 2 cycles. 1 of 4 years taught at a college, followed by 1 of 3 years taught at a lycée. Upon completion of the 1st cycle, students could take a state examination. Successful candidates received a secondary diploma. Upon completion of the first 2 years of the 2nd cycle, students could take a state examination for the first baccalaureate and, following their final year, they could take a similar examination for the 2nd baccalaureate. The Cambodian secondary curriculum was similar to that found in France. Beginning in 1967, the last 3 years of secondary school were split up into 3 sections according to major subjects: letters, mathematics and technology, agriculture, and biology. In the late 1960s and the early 1970s, the country emphasized a technical education. In the park, secondary education was reduced to 6 years. Higher education lagged well behind primary and secondary education until the late 1950s. The only facility in the country for higher education before the 1960s was the National Institute of Legal, Political, and Economic Studies, which trained civil servants. In the late 1950s, it had about 250 students. Wealthy Cambodians and those who had government scholarships sought university-level education abroad. Students attended schools in France, but after independence, increasing numbers enrolled at universities in the United States, Canada, China, the Soviet Union, and the German Democratic Republic. By 1970, universities with a total enrollment of nearly 9,000 students served Cambodia. The largest, the University of Phnom Penh, had nearly 4,570 male and more than 730 female students in 8 departments: letters and humanities, science and technology, law and economics, medicine, pharmacy, commercial science, teacher training, and higher teacher training. Universities operated in the provinces of Kampong Cham, Takiv, Battambang. In Phnom Penh, the University of Agricultural Sciences and the University of Fine Arts offered training. The increased fighting following the 1970 coup closed the 3 provincial universities. Destruction of the education system by the Khmer Rouge. During the Khmer Rouge regime, education was dealt a severe setback, and the great strides made in literacy and in education during the 2 decades following independence were obliterated systematically. Schools were closed. Educated people and teachers were subjected to, at the least, suspicion and harsh treatment and, at the worst, execution. At the beginning of the 1970s, more than 20,000 teachers lived in Cambodia. Only about 5,000 of the teachers remain 10 years later. Soviet sources report that 90% of teachers were killed under the Khmer Rouge regime. Only 50 of the 725 university instructors, 207 of the 2,300 secondary school teachers, and 2,717 of the 21,311 primary school teachers survived. The meager educational fare was centered on precepts of the Khmer Revolution. Young people were rigidly indoctrinated, but literacy was neglected. An entire generation of Cambodian children grew up illiterate. After the Khmer Rouge were driven from power, the education system had to be recreated from almost nothing. Illiteracy had climbed to more than 40%, and most young people under the age of 14 lacked any basic education. Development of the current system. Education began making a slow comeback, following the establishment of the People's Republic of Campuchia. In 1986, the following main institutions of higher education were reported in the park: the Faculty of Medicine and Pharmacy, the Chamkar-Dorm Faculty of Agriculture, the Kampusia USSR Friendship Technical Institute, the Institute of Languages, the Institute of Commerce, the Center for Pedagogical Education, the Normal Advanced School, the School of Fine Arts. Writing about the education system under the park, Vickery states, both the government and the people have demonstrated enthusiasm for education. The list of subjects covered is little different from that of pre-war years. There is perhaps more time devoted to Khmer language and literature than before the war until the 1984-85 school year, at least. No foreign language instruction. He notes that the secondary school syllabus calls for 4 hours of foreign language instruction per week in Russian, German, or Vietnamese, but that there were no teachers available. Martin describes the education system in the park as based very closely on the Vietnamese model, pointing out that even the terms for primary and secondary education have been changed into direct translations of the Vietnamese terms. Under the park regime, according to Martin, the primary cycle had 4 instead of 6 classes. The first level of secondary education had 3 instead of 4 classes, and the second level of secondary education had 3 classes. Martin writes that not every young person could go to school because schooling in towns and in the countryside required enrollment fees. Civil servants pay 25 reals per month to send a child to school, and others pay up to 150 reals per month. According to Martin, access to tertiary studies is reserved for children whose parents work for the regime and have demonstrated proof of their loyalty to the regime. She writes that, from the primary level on, the contents of all textbooks except for alphabet books was politically oriented and dealt more specifically with Vietnam. From the beginning of the secondary cycle, Vietnamese language study was compulsory. Buddhist education. Before the French organized a Western-style education system, the Buddhist Wat, with monks as teachers, provided the only formal education in Cambodia. The monks traditionally regarded their main education function as the teaching of Buddhist doctrine and history and the importance of gaining merit. Other subjects were regarded as secondary. At the Wat schools, boys, girls were not allowed to study in these institutions, were taught to read and to write Khmer, and they were instructed in the rudiments of Buddhism. In 1933 a secondary school system for novice monks was created in the Buddhist religious system. Many Wat schools had so-called Pali schools that provided 3 years of elementary education from which the student could compete for entrance into the Buddhist LYCE-AQTs. Graduates of these LYCE-AQTs could sit for the entrance examination to the Buddhist University in Phnom Penh. The curriculum of the Buddhist schools consisted of the study of Pali, Buddhist doctrine, and Khmer, along with mathematics, Cambodian history and geography, science, hygiene, civics, and agriculture. Buddhist instruction was under the authority of the Ministry of Religion. Nearly 600 Buddhist primary schools, with an enrollment of more than 10,000 novices and with 800 monks as instructors, existed in 1962. The Priya Sura Marit Buddhist Lycée, a 4-year institution in Phnom Penh founded in 1955, included courses in Pali, in Sanskrit, and in Khmer, as well as in many modern disciplines. In 1962 the student body numbered 680. The school's graduates could continue their studies in the Priya Sihanouk Raj Buddhist University created in 1959. The university offered 3 cycles of instruction. The doctoral degree was awarded after successful completion of the 3rd cycle. In 1962 there were 107 students enrolled in the Buddhist University. By the 1969-70 academic year, more than 27,000 students were attending Buddhist religious elementary schools, 1,328 students were at Buddhist LYCE-AQTs, and 176 students were enrolled at the Buddhist University. The Buddhist Institute was a research institution formed in 1930 from the Royal Library. The institute contained a library, record and photograph collections, and a museum. Several commissions were part of the institute. A folklore commission published collections of Cambodian folk tales. A Tripitaka commission completed a translation of the Buddhist canon into Khmer, and a dictionary commission produced a definitive 2-volume dictionary of Khmer. Private education. For a portion of the urban population in Cambodia, private education was important in the years before the communist takeover. Some private schools were operated by ethnic or religious minorities, Chinese, Vietnamese, European, Roman Catholic, and Muslim, so that children could study their own language, culture, or religion. Other schools provided education to indigenous children who could not gain admission to a public school. Attendance at some of the private schools, especially those in Phnom Penh, conferred a certain amount of prestige on the student and on the student's family. The private education system included Chinese language schools, Vietnamese language schools, French language schools, English language schools, and Khmer language schools. Enrollment in private primary schools rose from 32,000 in the early 1960s to about 53,500 in 1970. Although enrollment in private secondary schools dropped from about 19,000 to fewer than 8,700 for the same period. In 1962 there were 195 Chinese schools, 40 Khmer schools, 15 Vietnamese schools, and 14 French schools operating in Cambodia. Private secondary education was represented by several high schools, notably the Lycée Descartes in Phnom Penh, all of the Vietnamese schools in Phnom Penh, and some of the Chinese schools there were closed by government decree in 1970. There has been a re-emergence of private schools in Phnom Penh. Organizations from Turkey and the US operate private schools and charities. Zaman International operates 2 elementary and high schools, and Day New Day Cambodia pays for the housing and education of 100 students of different ages. Several non-governmental organizations dedicated to education provides this service oriented to unprivileged communities in rural areas. Street children, children infected by HIV, handicapped children and youth and other groups. Some organizations specialized in technical education offer to young people after high school completion and as an alternative to university. In 2012, Don Bosco Cambodia engaged 1,463 students to technical programs in provinces. But there are public and private technical schools like the National Technical Training Institute, the Phnom Penh Polytechnical School and many others.